Although Alexander's body may be lost to history, his legacy still lives. His brilliant war tactics are studied at military colleges today.
There are ways or patterns of thought and action that become apparent in studying Alexander's generalship. And those patterns are as applicable in the modern day world as they were in Alexander's time.
A top commander is responsible for thousands of lives and must possess vision, discipline, and the unshakable confidence of his troops. Alexander the Great was a charismatic leader who could rally his men on their long campaign. His ability to connect with his soldiers earned him fierce loyalty on the battlefield. Whatever he demanded of his men, Alexander would do himself, leading the charge and sharing the dangers.
He was out there meeting with the lowest level of his troops. He knew many of them by their names. They had been on the campaign for so long. And that bonded people to him.
Over the centuries, military commanders have relied on Alexander's battle-proven strategies. The Roman emperors were inspired by the autocratic Alexander. They loved him because he achieved what others thought was impossible. When Julius Caesar reached the age of 32, he reportedly wept at the thought that his accomplishments were not as great as those of Alexander's.
It's clear that, like so many other Romans, Julius Caesar had an Alexander complex. He suffered from Alexander envy. All Romans did.
One of the ancient world's greatest generals, Hannibal, was also influenced by Alexander. Both were driven by a hatred of an old enemy. Alexander wanted to punish the Persians, and Hannibal the Romans. And in revolutionary America, George Washington's military strategy owed a lot to Alexander.
Washington, in everything he did, you could actually trace the origins to Alexander the Great. The crossing of the Delaware is exactly a replica in terms of the strategies and tactics of Alexander the Great's battle at the Hydaspes.
In December 1776, General Washington led his ragged troops across the frozen Delaware River to attack the British. Their unexpected victory at Trenton became a turning point in the American War for Independence. As a schoolboy, the Corsican general Napoleon Bonaparte was fascinated by legends of Alexander the Great. Napoleon's ruthless ambition quickly propelled him through the army ranks. Like Alexander, he built his power on a series of daring military victories.
At the first opportunity, he followed in the footsteps of Alexander on his voyage to Egypt. He was most of all impressed by Alexander's religious policy, the way in which he adapted to whatever the circumstances were and adopted the point of view in whatever country he was present in.
In 1802, the French people voted him consul for life, and just 2 years later, Napoleon was crowned emperor. Like Alexander, Napoleon inspired total loyalty from his men. They both got to know their soldiers by name and rewarded them for their bravery on the battlefield.
When Napoleon was contemplating his invasion of Russia, he was thinking of Alexander because of the distances involved.
But unlike Alexander, Napoleon would face a painful defeat in battle and ultimate exile. Whatever his fate, Napoleon, like Alexander, was convinced he was a man of destiny. He believed that in warfare, men were nothing, but one man could win the day. George S. Patton, World War II general, was a commander cut from the same mold as Alexander.
From his very earliest days at West Point, George Patton admired the exploits of all the classical heroes, but in particular Alexander the Great. And there are several writings and notebooks that indicate that Patton did want to emulate the glories of Alexander past.
Like his idol, Patton studied his enemies for weaknesses. He could then work out the best way to beat them.
His hero was Alexander, and what he most admired him for was the discipline that he instilled in his troops.
Patton, like Alexander, seemed to be able to achieve what no other general could. In a bold move in 1944, a confident Patton switched the direction of his force, turning 100,000 men from the east to the north. Marching 100 miles in 3 days, they attacked the Germans. After 3 weeks of brutal fighting in what history calls the Battle of the Bulge, Patton's huge gamble paid off. Patton was welcomed home as a great general, but he still fell short of his hero, Alexander.
He is the gold standard for all times, for good and for ill. And this is what makes him such an attractive, in sense, almost an irresistible icon for anybody who aspires to leadership and greatness.
The art of war is only one part of Alexander's legacy. He also created new trade routes and forged cultural relationships between East and West.
Well, what Alexander does is indeed spread Greek culture, so that Greek tragedy is performed in what's now Iran. Greek philosophy makes its way ultimately through India all the way down to Sri Lanka. So an amazing cultural fertilization.
But above all, he is hailed as one of the most exceptional military leaders that ever lived. Alexander the Great has become a symbol of unbridled ambition and colossal achievement.
The courage, his intrepid nature, his spontaneity, the type of loyalty which he inspired, he was an incredible man by any stretch of the imagination.
Alexander the Great was a legendary leader, obsessed with his own myth. 2,500 years later, we are still talking about his amazing exploits. In the end, Alexander got just what he wanted.